does that mean? It means that it is historically variable. Where you are standing, at which point of time, at which point of space you are standing when you look at a piece of literature, what has been called literature down the ages. When you look at a text which is considered to have literary value, please remember it also depends on the power structure, on the on the space in which you are standing when you look at it. And therefore, Eagleton concludes that it can never be purely objective. All literature, when read, has a subjective angle to it. And that is why he says, when values change, our approach to literature changes. When values change, our attitude of what constitutes literature changes. And he would somehow like to relate it to the power structure, because in each age, literature is again rewritten. In fact, Eagleton goes as far as to argue that there is nothing which is a permanent value. And he argues that when values change, maybe we'd even begin to question whether Chaucer or Shakespeare is literature at all. He gives us a fantastic example of a test which the great critic I.A. Richards conducted in his class at the university. And the students were asked to judge various poems without being told who wrote it and in which age it was written. Strangely enough, interestingly enough, probably intriguingly enough, it was realized that most of the well-known poems by well-known poets did not get as many marks as those by very unknown writers. What does it prove? It proves that values change, attitudes change, opinions change. And therefore, my dear students, I want you to understand that literature cannot ever be a well-defined, definable entity. Literature is always changing and changeable, and literature cannot be an objective category, which means it becomes a subjective category. What I've attempted to do in the first part of this lecture is to give you some idea about what constitutes literature. And in attempting to do that, I've based my lecture on Terry Eagleton's essay, What is Literature? And the conclusion that we are drawing, my dear students, that it's not very easy to define literature. We know what literature is not. We know what constitutes literature down the ages. We also know that literature, the approach to literature, and what constitutes greatness to literature is a constantly changing phenomenon. I want you to remember that these modern writers have attempted to define for us certain terms which earlier we thought could be fit into slots, which we thought could be easily defined, which we thought 2 plus 2 is always 4. But what these modern writers and critics are attempting to do is to tell us that things change, and therefore our attitude, our approach to what was earlier considered to be well-defined also changes. Let us now move on to the second part of the lecture. This is about history and facts. Have you ever attempted to understand how we come to know about a particular age? Let's think of any age in history. Let's think of Indian history. Let's think of the Gupta age or the Maurya age or the Mughal age or the British period. Any period that we think of and we want to know what happened, we think we go to books of history. And when we go to the books of history, we get some answer. And that tells us something about the age. But what I'm now going to do is to look into another essay, which is called The Historian and His Facts. But what we are attempting to do here is not just talk about history, but somehow relate history and literature. I asked you, where do you get your facts about the Mughal age, the Gupta age, the Maurya age? Let me ask you, when you read a piece of work, when you read something that has been written, when you read something that has been written in the Mughal age, when you read something that has been written in the Gupta age, a poem maybe, an essay maybe, don't you think you get much more about the period? You know how the people lived, you know what they wore, you know what they ate, you know what they thought. All this might not come so clearly, so seriously, so obviously when you read history. And therefore, what you need to do is to look at this essay which Carr, a famous historian, Edward Carr, and the essay is called The Historian and His Facts. Where does a historian get his facts from? Where does a historian begin to write his essay? If you were to put it in modern computer language, can you always cut, copy, paste and write a book of history? Or is there something else that you need to do? He collects his facts. He gets his facts. And where does he get his facts from? If you're looking at ancient history, if you're looking at medieval history, where he needs to get his facts is from maybe inscriptions, maybe sculptures, maybe coins, etc. He collects all of them. But my dear students, have you wondered, how does he decide which facts to take? I've decided I want to write the history of Chandragupta Maurya. How do I decide what facts I want to choose? Carr puts it very beautifully when he tells us that the facts are not like a fish in a fish shop, where the fish has already been selected. It's not like that. Then what is it? He says it's like fish in an ocean. You just have to take this comparison very, very in detail, clearly to understand what Carr is saying about the choice of facts. Let me say that again for you. Not like fish in a fish shop, but like fish in the ocean. That means I, a fisherman, maybe an angler, I go to the ocean and then, like the historian has to collect his facts, like the fisherman has to collect his fish, catch his fish maybe, net his fish, angle for his fish, you need to sit somewhere. The fisherman needs to decide which part of the ocean he is going to. Which kind of fish are there, he probably knows or he probably doesn't know. And then, what is the net that he throws? What is the bait that he throws? Which kind of fish come there? What part of the year is it? What season is it? All this will determine what fish he is able to catch. He says, so too with the historian. Facts are required, he agrees. But then, what about the choice of facts? How do I decide? How does the historian decide which fact he wants to choose and which fact he does not want to choose? You might be wondering how all this is related to literature. But remember, my dear students, all literature, all literary texts are written in a historical context. That means a writer lives in a particular period. Something is happening then. Some things happen then. Some great events take place. And then the writer writes in that particular context. The great events of that period might not necessarily figure in his text. That doesn't matter. But yet, he is writing with that in the background. That forms the backdrop for his writings. And therefore, I'm trying to link for you the idea of history and literature. And therefore, when the historian goes to collect his facts, what does he do? Living in a particular place, living in a particular time, there are some accepted judgments. In this particular year, 2011, living in a country like India, maybe the writer already has certain facts chosen for him. And therefore, when he begins to write his history, he bases it on those facts which are already available for him. What does he do? He needs facts. Facts are important. And as somebody said, facts are all that are wanted in life. But then, once he has the facts, he has to choose which facts he wants to use. In choosing these facts, the judgments are based on the particular period in which he lives. That brings me to our next point, which is the philosophy of history. Which brings me to the next point, which is philosophy of history. What is the philosophy of history? This was something which began sometime when people started talking about history being only when the historian creates it. Facts of history we are told, do not exist for any historian till he creates them. This term, philosophy of history, was invented by Voltaire, and he says that facts of history do not exist till the historian creates them. And history is an enormous jigsaw puzzle with a lot of missing parts. Facts of history and other facts of the past vanish because the few known facts are all facts of history. What does it mean? Some event has taken place in the past. The historian is writing about that event. Are these two separate? No. The philosophy of history says that the past event and the historians thought about it. Let us think of any event in history, something that happened 1,000 years ago. Let us think of that event and let us think of a historian looking at it in the Elizabethan age. Let us think of the historian looking at it in the Restoration age, looking at it again in the Neoclassical age, in the Romantic age, in the Victorian age, and then looking at it in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. My dear students, the event is the same. But when it gets recorded in history, it is not just the event as it happened. Yes, agreed, the date cannot be changed. The place cannot be changed, but the way we look at it will change depending on where we are. And that is why the event and the historian's point of view, the two of them, what happens mutually, how they act and react on each other, the interaction that takes place between the event that happened 1,000 years ago and the historian's recording of it. It is this mutual which gives rise to the concept of the philosophy of history. Let me say that again. The event is a single event, but the same event is being looked at in different ages, from different contexts, by different people. And then the history that is being written about that same event will vary, because the historian's concept of the event is bound to have some effect on the writing of the history. And that is why we say history is the reenactment in the historian's mind of the thought whose history he is studying. History is the reenactment, please remember, where in the historian's mind. That means the entire event is being reprocessed, is being processed and reprocessed. In a sense, it is being rewritten. And therefore, when the historian writes about it, he thinks about it. He reenacts it in his mind. I'm sure you've heard of the phrase crossing the Rubicon. Julius Caesar crossed this little river called the Rubicon. We say crossing the Rubicon to indicate an action on which you cannot go back. That means your entire future is dependent on that single action. Which means historians have decided at a particular point in time that if Caesar had not crossed the Rubicon at that given moment, at that time, maybe the events of history would have been different. The historian decided that it is that important strategic moment which determined the future of Caesar. So what is happening? Let me repeat that. It is the reenactment in the mind of the historian, the thought about the events that took place much earlier. And therefore, with each age, with each period, with each country maybe, with each nation, with each power structure, the same event could be written differently as history, because the reenactment is taking place in the mind of the historian. So, the writing of history, according to the philosophy of history, is not just recording an event in an objective manner. It means that the historian thinks about it and comes to his decision. That brings me to the next question: how pure is history? As we have already seen that it cannot be just one point, it just cannot be something that is being repeated in all ages by all historians. We have to see that all history is refracted through the mind of the recorder. And therefore, we've got 2 points that we have to remember here. We have to talk about history and we have to talk about the historian. Let me quote for you Professor Oakeshott, who says, "History is the historian's experience. History is the historian's experience. It is made by nobody save the historian. To write history is the only way of making it." Please listen to that again. History is the historian's experience. So here you have a historian who is writing about the Kalinga War, who is writing about Ashoka's transformation when he saw all the soldiers, all the bloodshed, all the soldiers lying dead, all the bloodshed. It is the historian, his experience, which creates the history, which gives Ashoka all those feelings. What we are trying to say here is that no event recorded in history is simply an event. What we have to remember is it is the historian's experience which comes into the picture before history is recorded. How is history made? To quote the same professor, it is the writing of history which is the making of history. That is, historians decide how an event is to be looked at. Which means we have to decide that we have to come to the conclusion that there's nothing as pure history. All history is history as written by the historian. In order to do that, a point that is important for historians is an imaginative understanding. Carr gives us a number of examples to show how, if the historian does not have an imaginative understanding, what he writes, what he puts across, what he records might be a very one-sided. He takes examples from the recent past. He talks about the British historian writing about the Soviet Union. He talks about how, if there is no imaginative understanding, that is, if the historian, if the recorder of history, if the writer of history does not have an understanding of what that party is going through. Because here he's talking about the British-Soviet relationship. When he's talking about that, he says, if the British historian is not able to view the events from the Soviet point of view, he says, then the history that is recorded will not be true history. Because remember,